We have to handle the councilwoman. She's poking her nose where it doesn't belong.
Malik said, his voice sharper than she'd ever heard it.
If she doesn't back down, she'll have to feel the consequences.
Leah's chest tightened as she strained to hear more. Consequences? That wasn't the Malik she knew.
Thanks for watching Veedom Tales. Subscribe, give us a like, and hit the bell for more fun stories.
The crowd was electric, the hum of anticipation almost audible as everyone waited for Malik to take the stage. Leah stood in the front row, her gaze fixed on the podium set against the worn brick wall of the community center. Around her, neighbors whispered, excited and expectant. Malik always had that effect, drawing people in like moths to a flame. It was a skill she admired, a power she both respected and craved to understand. And then there he was, striding onto the makeshift stage with a presence that seemed to fill the entire block. Tall and broad-shouldered, Malik wore confidence like a second skin, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd before resting briefly on Leah. She felt her heart flutter as he gave her a small nod, his trademark smile spreading slowly across his face. In that moment, it felt like they were the only two people there, as if this whole gathering were a secret shared just between them.
Good evening, my people.
He began, his voice smooth and rich, carrying over the crowd with a warmth that made Leah shiver. He spoke with a passion that was rare in their neighborhood, a voice that promised safety, hope, a way out of the struggles that kept so many of them trapped.
This community belongs to us, and I'm here to remind you that together, we are unstoppable.
The crowd roared, swept up in his words, his energy. Leah watched him, transfixed, her admiration deepening with each phrase. He painted a vision of a future where they'd no longer rely on outsiders to fund their schools, where they'd no longer be at the mercy of politicians who didn't know their lives or struggles. And as he spoke, Leah believed in that future. She wanted to be part of it, to stand by his side and help him build it. It had been months since she first met Malik, but the memory was still vivid. He had approached her after a youth rally, complimenting her on her commitment and ideas.
We need more people like you, Leah.
He'd said, his gaze intense.
People who care enough to make a difference.
From that moment, she was his, captivated by his charisma, his power, and eventually his love. But now, months later, something was changing. Malik had become more secretive, his influence stretching farther than Leah had anticipated, and as his power grew, so did her questions. The first time Leah sensed something was wrong, it was subtle. Malik had gathered a few of his close allies after hours, and Leah had waited in the next room, reading over some plans for the next youth program. Their voices drifted through the thin wall, the tone low and tense.
We have to handle the councilwoman. She's poking her nose where it doesn't belong.
Malik said, his voice sharper than she'd ever heard it.
If she doesn't back down, she'll have to feel the consequences.
Leah's chest tightened as she strained to hear more. Consequences? That wasn't the Malik she knew. He was a visionary, a protector. He wouldn't hurt anyone, would he? The conversation grew quieter, and Leah's mind raced, trying to justify what she'd heard. Maybe it was just talk, a tactic to keep his followers in line. But as the days passed, Malik's true nature began to emerge in fragments, each one sharper and more terrifying than the last. He began pressuring her to cut off certain people from the center's activities.
They're not loyal, Leah. If they're not with us, they're against us,
he said one evening, his gaze hard. When she voiced concern, his jaw tightened and he pulled her close, his hand lingering just a little too tightly on her arm.
You're my ride or die, right?
He whispered, his tone both tender and unnervingly firm. Leah nodded, but she could feel her heartbeat hammering against her ribs. She wanted to believe in him, in the man who promised to make things better, but there was a darkness creeping in, a side of him that she hadn't seen before. And then one night, she stumbled upon the truth she couldn't ignore. She had left her phone charger in Malik's office after a long day and returned to retrieve it. But as she reached the door, she heard voices inside. Malik was talking with Karim, one of his most loyal followers, a man known around the neighborhood for his ruthless reputation.
Karim.
Malik's voice was low and cold, sending a chill down Leah's spine.
The councilwoman hasn't backed off and it's becoming a problem. I want her to know there's a price for crossing us.
Kareem chuckled darkly.
Consider it done, boss.
Leah's breath caught in her throat. She pressed her hand against her mouth, fighting to stay silent, as fear pooled in her stomach. She felt the walls closing in, her heart hammering so loudly she was sure they'd hear it. Malik, he was ordering a threat, or worse. He wasn't the savior she thought he was. He was a wolf in sheep's clothing, his charm a mask for something dangerous, something she had willingly, naively become a part of. She backed away from the door, her hands trembling as she tried to make sense of what she'd just heard. The man she loved, the man she'd devoted herself to, was capable of violence, manipulation, deceit. The vision of hope he'd painted was an illusion, a mirage hiding the ugliness underneath. That night, Leah lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, gripped by a paralyzing fear. She wanted to leave, to run as far from Malik as possible, but she knew that wasn't an option. Malik was powerful, and he had eyes everywhere. If he suspected she was turning against him, she didn't even want to imagine what he might do, but staying silent meant becoming complicit, allowing his power to fester and grow unchecked. She couldn't ignore the truth, even if it terrified her, even if it meant risking everything. She had to do something. Leah took a shaky breath, summoning courage from deep within herself. She was no longer the girl who had fallen in love with Malik's charm. She was someone else now, someone who had seen the monster behind the mask and knew that she couldn't look away. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone and texted Jasmine, her closest friend, the only person she trusted. "We need to talk. It's about Malik." The words felt like a death sentence, but she sent them anyway, knowing there was no going back. She would expose Malik no matter the cost. For her community, for herself. For the first time, she was stepping out of the shadow of his power and into her own. Leah's fingers hovered over her phone, her heart racing as she waited for Jasmine's reply. Every second felt stretched, each tick of the clock amplifying her fear. Finally, the screen lit up with a response. "Meet me tomorrow night at my place. Come alone." ****. Leah exhaled, her hands shaking as she placed her phone back on the table. She tried to calm herself, but Malik's voice from earlier echoed in her head, cold and menacing. She was terrified, but a small spark of defiance flickered within her. She had spent months in Malik's world, blinded by his promises, his charm, his magnetism. But now she saw him for what he really was, a man obsessed with control, willing to hurt anyone who dared to stand in his way. The next day crawled by in slow motion. Leah went about her routine at the community center, forcing herself to smile, to pretend that nothing had changed. Malik was there, of course, moving through the room with his usual easy confidence, throwing her the occasional affectionate smile. To anyone watching, they looked like the perfect couple dedicated to each other and to the neighborhood. But inside, Leah was a storm of fear and anger. Every time Malik touched her shoulder or laughed in her ear, she felt a cold dread seeping into her bones. She knew he could sense something was off. He kept watching her, his gaze lingering as though he could see the secrets churning inside her. She had to stay calm, keep up the act, at least until she could meet with Jasmine. When night finally fell, Leah made her way to Jasmine's apartment. She kept glancing over her shoulder, paranoid that someone, maybe even Malik, was following her. The streets felt darker, more menacing, as if Malik's shadow stretched across the whole neighborhood. She reached Jasmine's door and knocked quietly, her heart pounding. Jasmine opened the door quickly, her eyes filled with concern.
"Leah, come in."
Once inside, Leah felt a wave of relief, finally able to drop the mask she'd worn all day. She sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands.
"Jasmine, he's dangerous. Malik, he's not who I thought he was. I overheard him planning something against the councilwoman, like he was going to hurt her if she didn't back down."
Jasmine's face darkened.
"I've suspected something for a while now. He's been pushing people around, using intimidation to get what he wants. People are too scared to speak up, Leah. But I didn't think it was this bad."
Leah looked up, her eyes filled with determination.
We have to do something. I can't just stand by while he keeps using everyone. I feel like I'm a part of this now, and I can't let him keep doing this.
Jasmine nodded, her expression hardening.
We'll need proof. He's too powerful. People need to see what he's really doing if we're going to turn them against him.
Together, they spent the next few hours mapping out a plan. Leah would gather evidence, documents, recordings, anything that would reveal the truth. Jasmine would talk to a few trusted members of the community, people who had started to question Malik's methods but were too afraid to take action. They would work quietly under Malik's radar until they had enough to expose him. In the days that followed, Leah's life became a delicate balancing act. She continued to play the role of Malik's loyal partner, smiling when he asked her to, agreeing with his plans, all while working behind his back to bring him down. She felt sick with guilt every time she looked him in the eye, knowing the betrayal she was hiding, but her resolve only strengthened each time she saw him manipulate and intimidate those around him. One evening, Malik invited her out for dinner. They sat across from each other in a dimly lit restaurant, and for a moment Leah almost forgot the darkness lurking beneath his charm. He reached across the table, his fingers lacing with hers, his smile soft.
You've been quiet lately, Leah.
He said, his eyes searching her face.
Is something bothering you?
Her heart skipped a beat, but she forced a smile.
Just tired,
she replied, keeping her voice steady.
We've been working so hard. I guess it's starting to wear on me.
Malik's eyes narrowed slightly as though he were trying to read her thoughts. She held her breath, praying he wouldn't see the truth in her eyes.
You know I'm here for you, right?
He said finally, his voice soothing. But there was an edge to it, a subtle reminder of his control.
As long as you're with me, you have nothing to worry about.
Leah nodded, her stomach churning as his words sank in. She was more afraid of him now than ever, but she kept her expression neutral, smiling back at him as though nothing was wrong. The day of reckoning arrived sooner than she had anticipated. Leah had managed to gather enough evidence, voice recordings, documents, and even messages from Malik to Karim, detailing his threats and plans to intimidate anyone who stood in his way. Jasmine had spread the word quietly, inviting trusted community members to a meeting at the center that evening. Malik had no idea. He was away on a business meeting and would return only later that night, leaving Leah and Jasmine the perfect window to expose him. As people filed into the community center, there was a heavy tension in the air. Leah felt the weight of their expectations, their trust. She knew they were all watching her, waiting for her to prove that Malik wasn't the leader he pretended to be. Taking a deep breath, she began playing the recordings, showing the documents, explaining the extent of Malik's manipulation. The crowd reacted with a mixture of shock, anger, and betrayal. They had believed in Malik just as she had, and now they were grappling with the realization that he had been using them, controlling them. As the final piece of evidence played, a voice cut through the silence, a voice that chilled Leah to the bone.
Well. Look at this.
Leah's blood froze. She turned to see Malik standing in the doorway, his gaze cold, his expression unreadable. He had returned early. He took a few steps inside, the room growing tense as people backed away, some murmuring nervously.
Exposing me, Leah?
Malik said, his voice low and dangerous.
I trusted you. I brought you into my world, and this is how you repay me?
Leah stood her ground, though every fiber of her being screamed for her to run.
You lied to everyone, Malik. You were using us, using the community. This was never about helping people. It was about controlling them.
He smirked, his eyes glinting with a dark amusement.
Power always comes with control, Leah. You wouldn't understand. You're too naive, too weak to know what it takes to lead.
The crowd was silent, watching the exchange with wide eyes. Leah felt her fear, raw and pulsing, but she drew strength from the people around her. She wasn't alone anymore.
I'm not weak,
she said, her voice steady.
I'm just not afraid of you anymore.
Malik's face twisted in anger, but before he could respond, Karim appeared in the doorway, flanked by two officers Jasmine had quietly called as backup. Seeing the evidence against him, Malik had no choice but to leave the building in handcuffs. his reign over the community shattered. As the officers led him away, Leah felt a wave of relief and fear all at once. Malik would not forget this, but he was gone, for now. In the days that followed, the community banded together, choosing leaders who genuinely cared, people who wanted to build rather than control. And Leah, despite the fear that still lingered, felt a newfound strength within her. She had faced Malik's shadow and had emerged from it, no longer a pawn in his world, but a force of her own.